your book, but those are the basics as far as the actual geographical areas. If you turn to section 2 in your book, which is on page 74, right? 74, yeah, 74, you will see the rulers of Egypt. Now, this is a little bit more in depth. This section's a little bit more in depth. When you deal with the rulers of Egypt, there are many types of rulers. The most famous ruler, of course, was a person called the Pharaoh. Whoa, excuse me, burping. On page 74, you will also see your key terms again. Pharaoh, dynasty, absolute power, and regent. You will remember that a pharaoh was the title of the king of ancient Egypt. Make sure you use that complete definition. A dynasty also is a complete definition, and that is a series of rulers from the same family line or ethnic group. Okay? Absolute power goes along with the pharaoh and this dynasty in the sense that they had complete control over basically everybody and everything within the land that could not be questioned. And a regent occurred when, if a pharaoh was born but he or she was a child, and whoever was ahead of them, if they passed away or they died early, then the regents, who were kind of advisors, they would rule together and help the child learn the proper ways of the pharaoh, learn about government and politics and trade and marketplace and all those different kinds of things until the child was old enough that they could actually rule. That is all found on page 74 as well. Okay? Alright, so on page 74, it starts off with the pharaoh, and your book talks about a couple of different pharaohs. The first one is mentioned is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. 3 syllables, just break it down. Hatshepsut. Good, you got that? Excellent. So, that was one of the most famous women, and even though I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, she was important because, if you look on page 78, the only reason I'm kind of jumping is because they mentioned her early and then they talk about her later. So, at one point, she was a regent and she ruled, and after a while she then took over control. On page 78 you can see she was called the Pharaoh Queen, and it was actually very, very good for Egypt. She was one of the most successful female pharaohs, even though Cleopatra was probably one of the more popular ones. Hatshepsut actually did quite a bit of good. She sent expeditions to far-off lands. She was able to increase trade actually all along the entire Mediterranean Sea coast. And even though her male counterpart, in other words, the Thutmose, was supposed to kind of take over, even though he was supposed to take over, she basically was like, whatever, I'm the dudette. I'm not the dude, I'm the dudette, and I'm the one who is in control. Remember the Washington Monument. Now, the Washington Monument I mentioned in class, it's this big, tall building like this. It's got a kind of like a pyramid at the top, right? Okay. Now, the Washington Monument is called an obelisk. Obelisk. All right? That's what it's called. And an obelisk is kind of like an architectural structure that Queen Hatshepsut, or Pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut, absolutely loved it. She's one of the most famous for kind of instituting, having all these obelisks, something similar to the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., built all around her kingdom. All right? I'll come back to Hatshepsut in a little bit, but I want to rewind here just for a sec and go back to 74 and 75. Read your books, right? Section, look down at the very, very bottom. It's hard to see because my video camera is kind of boogered up, but you guys will get the idea. So, it talks about a dynasty, and a dynasty, of course, is a series of rulers from the same family. Now, we talked a little bit about intermarriage, and that kind of freaked everybody out, and it's understandable because that's just nasty, but they did. They had a series of intermarriages that tried to keep the same bloodline and the family and the dynasty all together so that no one could kind of sneak in, take over, wipe out the true pharaoh and the pharaoh's family, and kind of gain control, gain power of the kingdom. You will remember that throughout all of Egypt, those dynasties lasted predominantly through the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Remember, the kingdoms are time periods. They are not actual kingdoms. When we think of kings or somebody's ruling over a land, they're not actually... I think I heard something stop and I just got a little confused. My electric oven fan, I was doing some baking. Yeah, I actually bake. I was doing some baking a little earlier and whipping up something for Josh in the oven, and then the heat fan just stopped. I hope that's okay. I hope it's not broken. If I catch on fire, stop, drop, and roll, and call 911 and send them to my house. So a dynasty was a series of rulers, most of the time from the same family. They didn't trust people, so they wouldn't marry outside of the family. Instead, they stayed kind of together, very, very close, cousins intermarrying, and of course we know now that genetically that just kind of boogers everything up, and it's not only unsanitary and nasty, but it's not healthy. Okay? So when we look at page 75, Egypt is unified. Now remember, there was an Upper Egypt and a Lower Egypt, and those were kind of independent lands for a while, even though they were organized by elevation. King Menes, or Menes, M-E-N-E-S, was the guy who united them. Everybody say, unite. Okay? He brought them together and basically unified Egypt under one major crown or one major ruler or one major pharaoh or dynasty. All right? They had absolute power. Even though they had advisors, they could basically do what they want and say what they want. Why? You don't know? You don't remember? Of course you do. It's because of the fact that the pharaoh was viewed as a god or goddess here on earth. So it was a human form, so the Egyptians believed that they were actually a god or goddess here on earth. So you couldn't really question the god or the goddess, because that would be silly, because you'd be done. And who wants to be done? You want to live a life where you can hang out and take vacations and drink iced tea and buy stuff and enjoy a good time with your family and friends. So the three kingdoms, the Old Kingdom is when the pyramids were built, if you remember that. If you don't, I just told you, and now you will. And the Old Kingdom is a time when all this big building, this illustrious, large architecture, the pharaohs wanted to seem like they were bigger than life, grandiose, humongous types of buildings and statues and all kinds of things in their honor, okay? And yeah, they were pretty egocentric and self-centered, but you know, they were pharaohs and they were considered gods on earth, so why would they think that they couldn't be? Because who was going to question them, right? Right. All right, so then we come into the Middle Kingdom, which your book talks just a little bit about. The Middle Kingdom was predominantly irrigation projects. The Egyptians knew that in order to survive further down the river, so if I do this, so the Nile Delta up in here was all groovy because of the fact that it flooded. But in order for them to survive farther down, or rather farther up, depending on which direction you're going, because you're going uphill, even then you're headed south. I know it's kind of freaky, but you get the idea if you have your compass rose. Okay? So they needed to irrigate. Now, irrigation is basically a series of man-made canals and trenches that they can stop and start the flow of water, like this. Okay? I irrigated myself. Not really, I kind of hydrated because irrigation's a little different. If you look on page 77, it talks about irrigation projects, and because of that, trade increased. The New Kingdom, Old, Middle, and now New. The New Kingdom possessed the time when the kingdom began to expand. It began to drive out different tribes in and around the area, and that's the time here. Is that right? Let me look here real quick. That's the time here when, when King Tut comes on the scene. Remember, King Tut is born, and there's three regents, and we talked about Horemheb, we talked about Ai, we talked about his mom, and we talked about the fact that he died early, and we're not positive why, it doesn't really matter, but what is important is that he's one of the most famous kings of ancient Egypt because, if you look on page 77, it talks about in 1922, Howard Carter was the archaeologist who discovered his tomb. And you will remember that we talked about it being basically perfect. It was untouched for thousands of years. So that when it was sealed, nobody got in there, nobody got a chance to touch anything, nobody got a chance to steal anything. It was untouched the entire time. And that's why he's probably the most well-known and most famous king. Hatshepsut, we talked about a little bit. Let me see here. Hatshepsut was, as I said, a regent. And I'm just kind of looking through. If you look on page 79, one thing that might be really good for you is to, on section 2 assessment, that's right here, very bottom, okay, there are a series of comprehension and critical thinking questions. It would be a good idea to read through those, just become a little bit familiar with those questions and some basic answers, all right? Some of the information taken from the textbook for the test does come from some of that material, okay? So that is the basic idea of the rulers, the kingdoms. We talked about a few of them. We talked about the pharaohs. We talked about the regents, absolute power, dynasties, the families, Queen Hatshepsut. We talked about King Tut, Tutankhamun. We talked a little bit in your book. It talks on page 79 about Queen Cleopatra being kind of the last to really rule Egypt. And then your book goes right into page 80, which is Egyptian religion.